Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.
Welcome, folks, to the Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, good old Iowa, on Iowa Catholic Radio. Whether you're listening through the Iowa Catholic Radio waves on our mini stations we have throughout the state, through iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or our wonderful podcast listeners, thank you for listening to the show. Bud, we're going to reverse a few things today anyway, so how about you go first? What do you do at Mercy College of Health Sciences here in Des Moines, Iowa?
I am the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences, so if a student needs a math course, a science course, or preeminently a philosophy course, they can turn to my department, which I oversee. That's redundant, but yes.
Okay, now you have to ask me.
Bo, what do you do at the college?
Oh, thank you for asking, Bud. I am the Senior Advisor for Mission Initiatives here at said Iowa, Mercy College of Health Sciences, also the Director for the for the Center for Human Flourishing. It is wonderful to be on the show today, but I think one thing that's different for everyone is you can see some grass here in the middle of Iowa.
It's February. Yeah. This is moving quickly, but this is an interesting February because Lent comes soon, or sooner than it normally does. It's an early Lent, and Ash Wednesday falls on Valentine's Day. So if you are thinking of treating your beloved, you may want to do so the weekend beforehand, which could save you some money because I know reservations and things at Valentine's Day are hot commodities.
I was thinking you could do it the day before and call it Fat Valentine's, but maybe that doesn't work.
Be careful when you're throwing out that phrase. No, it's, the Fat Valentine's. And then we joked about this last year, but once you get past Ash Wednesday, you see the vestiges of Catholic culture here in the United States because all of a sudden, Bebops and other fine institutions have
fish sandwiches,
discounted fish sandwiches.
I mean, I see it early. It's obvious no one in the fast food industry realizes that it's a moving target. Because I see people, it's usually late January, early February, and they're just like, just start it around then.
It would be interesting to be on the inside of those boardrooms or wherever they make those decisions, because I wonder if they even connect it to Lent. They just know, the days are getting longer. We need to start rolling out the fish discounts.
That would be great if, it's an astronomical calculation for them and not anything about, knowing that there's Catholics. I also want to know what they're doing with the fish other times of the year. Bebop's here in Des Moines. God bless them. You can get a fish sandwich throughout the year, so you can eat there on Fridays. Yeah. But not that that's a sponsorship or anything. But man, when you're Arby's, I think, and you don't do fish until Lent or February, what's going on, man? Is it just they just hard freeze them until? I'm worried, is what I'm saying.
Well, fried fish is kind of like mac and cheese. It's one of those things that are difficult to mess up. The quality of the filet you choose probably makes a difference, but one of my great disappointments here in Des Moines is, and again, we should be careful with mentioning establishments, but Slick Gillet. In some parts of the country, they have a fish sandwich.
And it's good.
Yeah, but they don't have it here in Iowa. At least not that I've found.
No, and when they're trying, they're always supposed to be my pleasure and be nice to you, and they're still polite, but you can tell that they're very confused. And you would just figure that since Chick-fil-A, or this place you're talking about, comes from a southern part of the state, that they would have a little, warning. Southerners might be asking you for fish in February, but they do not.
I've had Lents where I wander the inner atrium of Chick-fil-A looking for fish sandwiches and never happens. But where you can go and find what you need or are looking for is Mercy College of Health Sciences.
Yeah, you've reversed. That was a perfect segue. I'm sorry for interrupting you. It was in this day that we're reversing things. Perfect, bud. A+.
Who underwrites the show, the medical field, it's doing such important work right now, and we do believe that Mercy College of Health Sciences here in the heart of Des Moines is a beacon of light and a great beachhead.
Oh, I like that.
Of Catholic education, preparing healthcare professionals.
Is this just because the days are getting longer that you were thinking of beaches?
I didn't actually know where that sentence was going to end. It was one of those where it's I need another participial phrase, but I think it was still open-ended the way I phrased it there.
Well, either way, I think you're dead on here. mchs.edu. Thank you, Mercy College, for underwriting this show. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. It's so wonderful to have you with us. Bud, we tried something new a few weeks ago. We were calling it a reverse show. It's not really all that reverse. What we were saying is you have a propensity, I'll put it that way, that if anybody who listens to the show knows, that you will ask me and you'll warn me. You'll say, this is a really hard question, and maybe you'll get canceled because I ask it. And you're usually asking it with like a minute before break. But you'll ask me the deep questions, and then we'll roll from there. So I was like, well, you are a smart lad. You have letters after your name. So I should do the same. So we did that with an email, and I asked you if you thought that I responded well to it. So, vain man that I am, I have a Facebook post that was a response to a sermon I heard, and I want you to tell me if you think there's something to it or not. Okay. So is that going to work for another reverse? That what we should do is say The Uncommon Good, but then play it in reverse.
I like how we create our own sound effects. Like, we probably have the technology to do voice emoji. There you go. Oh, man, that's very relaxing.
But I like ours.
We need to do more of that. But the ones that are homemade are memorable.
Homemade is a great way. Yeah. We're like human beatboxes is what we're saying. For this show, though, I'm going to ask. So I heard a sermon from Iowa Catholic Radio's own Father P.J. McManus, and it was a wonderful sermon. It actually went in a different direction, but at one point, he was saying, of course, that Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. The way, the truth, and the life, which is an interesting way for Jesus to talk about himself. Father PJ, I promise if you're listening, I listened to the rest of the homily. I promise I did. But what started rolling my head was this idea of if Jesus decides he's going to call himself the way, the truth, and the life, those are in many ways, open-ended is probably the wrong way to say it, because I don't want to make it sound like anything goes. But certainly it's not utilitarian, obvious sort of ways in which we can truncate what it means to follow Jesus. A way, of course, is something that we follow, even if we don't maybe know the entirety of the path. But the way we go, this is the way we're going to follow and end up where we need to go. The truth, there's many ways that truth can sound like, oh, of course it has to be the truth. What else can it be? But as I know we've talked on the radio show before, and anybody who knows me, I try to point out that the truth often gets flattened because people want to grab a hold of it rather than follow it. And then finally, the life, right? So to say that Jesus is the life is to say that the whole process of following him is its own reward and not simply just what it gets you. So, Bud, in my feeble old mind, what I thought of is what that means, of course, is that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. But what he's not then is a checklist rather than a way. He's not certainty. Truth is not the same thing as certainty. And he's not some sort of jackpot, or I was first going to say reward, but of course he is a reward, but like I mean a reward like a jackpot, right? We do something just to get this thing in the end. So he's the way, he's not a checklist, he's the truth, he's not certainty, and he's a life, the life, not just a jackpot. And I said, what I'm not trying to do is act like I'm hardcore here, or I've like lived a rough life, or I'm like exceedingly wise. Because on many points in my life, I really wish Christianity was just a checklist, was certainty, and that I had a jackpot. The jackpot would really come in handy with 5 kids. But what I thought to say is it's important that if you hear people selling Christianity to you, or a version of it, that sure sounds like a checklist you follow, certainty all the way through, and a jackpot rather than a process, you can really disregard them as unserious. And so to start off this reverse, the uncommon good, how wrong do you think I am, or do you think I'm on the right path?
No, I think you're on to something there. You know, Jesus is one of those figures that's so well known just by association, or, you know, like if you ask someone on the street or in a classroom, do they know who Jesus was? The vast majority of Americans would say yes, but it's fascinating, Bo, when we've taught classes and we have students engage just the surface of the Gospels, the gap, I think, between what Jesus actually said and did and what people assume that he did. And so that really ties into this whole conversation because, okay, one thing about our Lord is that when you bring up Jesus as a religious figure or spiritual leader, I think a lot of Americans assume that he was primarily about delivering teachings or moral instruction. Now, you have the Sermon on the Mount. You have all sorts of instances in the Bible where Christ calls persons to specific sort of like ethical mandates. So I don't want to pretend like it's not there at all. But where Jesus stands out, I think, from other religious figures, say the two that come quickly to mind are maybe Muhammad and then the Buddha, is that he went at the heart of his message is this kind of challenge asking his followers, who do you say that I am? And so he calls his disciples to a certain way, but it's intrinsically connected to his identity as the Messiah, as the Son of God. Now, that's fascinating because when we talk about a way, as you were pointing out, it's not a checklist. It's not so much like I don't think we can even distill down the Sermon on the Mount and say you just do these things and approach it as a checklist. A way reminds me of, so in another gospel passage, our Lord says that he's the gate. And it's like you cannot approach the Father, you cannot approach the fullness of life apart from encountering Jesus. And the early followers of Jesus, so after he ascended into heaven, Christianity was originally known as the way. And so it's presented as this way of life. Now, some liberal theologians or progressive theologians, you could say, I think they hear those things or they present those things and they say like, well, doctrine isn't so important, whatnot. And they present it as the church lost its way, pun intended, when it sort of got bogged down in these intricate, very technical doctrinal discussions. And I don't want to present that dichotomy. So, for instance, in Eastern liturgies, when the congregation professes the creed, before they charge into the creed, they say something to the effect, I'm not a frequent attendee of Eastern liturgies, but something like, let us confess with one voice so that we can love each other better or more well. Better, I think. Struggling with English here. And so like the faith, the belief is intrinsically connected to how you live and how you love. And that's where I think you're saying like maybe we go off the path sometimes by losing that idea that Jesus Christ is the way, something that's connected to his identity, but also a certain shape to our lives so that you can't truly know who God is and who he's revealed himself to be without walking that path.
Oh, no, I think that's very interesting that a gate or a door, we hear, like doors of mercy, for instance, quite a bit. That's an image that allows us to not go too far down either excessive path. So on one hand, the checklist thing makes it really, this rule-following aspect. But on the other hand, as you're pointing out, so people who think, oh, well, he came to abolish the law, even though he clearly says he hasn't, they read grace to be, well, there's nothing you really have to do at all. So a way, like you said, is not rule, govern, check things off, but nor is it just walk freely in the wilderness. A way, a path, it shows you where to go, but you have to be the one taking the steps. So the gate of the sheepfold, for instance, or a door of mercy is interesting because certainly what that's saying is there is an opening where you can go to where you haven't been. And right, that seems to be at least one part of this metaphor. You who are outside the people of God, you're a Gentile, you're a sinner, depends on what part of the Bible we're talking about. You have been led to a door or a gate that you can enter, but the walls haven't all fallen down. Like, I think that's interesting that doors only work if the wall that doesn't change is steady, right? Same thing with a gate. A gate only makes sense if the rest of it is, in fact, a wall, a fence, or whatever it might be. And so a way, a path, Jesus showing us, shining a light to where we need to go in the dark, is not simply walk wherever you want, nor is it do these specific things. And that goes back, Bud, to these themes have really been hitting on us in this new year. I think once more about the three wise men, that they had to prepare themselves, and grace, totally unearned, right, shows up. But then they have to walk towards the grace. So in the same way, the way is not, if you do these things, you deserve to be where I'm at, nor is it do whatever you want and I'll just sort of throw benefits on you. It's a call and response. You have to be looking for the gate. Grace is the gate opening, and then you have to walk through it. And that's a lot different than a checklist or do whatever you want.
That's where the study of God or knowledge of God just is different than a lot of other fields that we undertake. We've gotten into the etymology of theology on the show before. So this word theology, which is the combination of theos, a reference to God, and then logos, which means like reason or rationality, but it's used to say the study of. So you think about terms like biology, zoology, cosmology. They're all the study of some sort of like scientific field of inquiry. I wish that theology in some ways was, I'll probably get the construction wrong, but like theosophy or, I don't know, we talk about philosophy, which is the love of wisdom. Really, theology, it can be the study of God, but it's really an encounter with God. And you think about the most important things in life, a relationship. I would compare this maybe to a pilgrimage. If you were to go on a pilgrimage to a holy site, you could read about that site. You could do like a virtual reality tour, but nothing can replace actually taking the steps to get there. And if you were to travel to Fatima or to Lourdes, there's an encounter that takes place there, an event that's irreplaceable apart from being in that place, you know, seeing where things happen, touching the stones, etc. It's the same way with God. We could read all the St. Augustine, all the Thomas Aquinas, all the Teresa of Avila that we wanted to, but until we've actually encountered God in a personal manner, we can't say that we truly know God, and certainly we can't say that we love him in the true sense of that word. Now, all that to kind of come to the point where when we talk about the way, another thing that I think is worth emphasizing is that this way is intrinsically communal. So this is another sort of like encountering Jesus for the first time, but we've said to our students before, like what term or what word does Christ use more than any other? If you cut out like articles like a and the, I think I've done my homework, even like charity or love. The word that Christ uses most often during his public ministry is basileia, which we usually translate kingdom, but probably more precisely something like the reign. So the basileia of God, the kingdom or the reign of God. And so what Christ is bringing into the world and what he's calling us into is a way that's communal, and it involves this kind of public form of witness. And I emphasize that at the end of this comment because there's so many ways that we frame or construe spirituality now that are individualistic. You know, you keep your prayer journal, you do your devotion time, even the sacraments, like receiving Holy Communion can become this sort of like drive-through sacramentality. Not that God's graces might not, you know, encounter you there, but really the way of life that Jesus calls us to is to be in relationship with other people, and then in that relationship to be a shining light out into the world. There's a lot more that I could say about that, but I'll pause for now because you look like you have something
the only
interesting you want to add.
I want to point out that there is a group that call themselves the Theosophists. They are 19th century occult mystical syncretists. Which, I'll be honest with you.
We'll have the link to our podcast.
I mean, here, I'll show Bud what their symbol is while telling you, reader. It has like a swastika and the Star of David and like the Egyptian cross.
When the name
snake.
When the name rolled off my tongue, I did have a moment of trepidation that maybe I'd set people down the wrong path.
No, but the reason I bring it up is not just to like show that we're not affiliated with them. I think that you bring up a good point. I've thought that too, that you start to think, what does it mean, you know, when we talk about the study of God? Now, I know you would agree with this. Part of the reason, of course, is theology will sometimes make a distinction between theology, which is what humans could reasonably study about divinity on their own, and then divine revelation. So some people will even act like divine revelation isn't even theology itself. Now, we're mostly splitting hairs here, but of course the idea is the teaching of divine revelation, God just gives it. So it is given. And theology, so to speak, works it out, the logic of this God and how we live. But to your point, theosophy, even though it got stolen, I think gets to this idea of what does it mean to... In fact, the Theosophists, what I was reading, seems nearly opposite to your point, which is to say, we don't have a theology of truth, which is what they're saying. What you're pointing out is, how is it that a way, instead of it just being a roll call of teachings, gets us down the path? So you mentioned the Beatitudes a bit ago. It's interesting. Again, I don't want to make this opposition like some people do, but it is interesting that, you guessed it, but I'm going to bring this up, post the printing press, you see Christianity get really obsessed with the 10 Commandments. Even though, for instance, right, there's no mention of the number 10 in either of the places in the Old Testament that they show up. But this idea of like, there's 10 of them and it's a verse and it's analytical, right? Like that really appeals to us. The Beatitudes, although we can name them 8, even though that itself, but if you really be honest about where the Beatitudes show up, they are much more organically connected to like what go before and after them. But even if you try to make them like a list, Jesus doesn't allow himself to get pinned down. So first of all, he doesn't say these are he's like, you need to do these. And again, I'm not trying to say we should not do the 10 Commandments. In some ways, the 10 Commandments are, like we were saying, there's a sort of preconditions that then allow something like a beatific life to sprout up, to occur. You have to have a foundation before anything can be built or grown. Yeah. But the Beatitudes don't say, go do these things. It says, these are the people who are blessed. And then it throws a curveball, right? Mm-hmm. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Well, that's just something you're going to chew on for the rest of your life. And I think that this is where the way connects to the truth. People go to the Beatitudes looking for certainty. They don't see it. They think there's a certain type of certainty that the 10 Commandments have that the Beatitudes don't. And so they sort of go, yeah, the Beatitudes are sort of nice poetry, but I'm going to stick with these commandments that tell me what to do. They want the checklist because they want certainty. Yeah. But if what we've given is a way to, like you said, pursue the truth because we love it, then the Beatitudes are sort of the emblems of everything that you were saying about the kingdom. What does it mean to live in the kingdom, to follow the path to the kingdom and then live in its truth? And it's these poetic mysteries that actually the most blessed people are often, in the world's terms, thought as the most unlucky, the most unfortunate. Yeah. And that is a sort of ground-shifting way for us to imagine all these things.
No, those are all really great points. I mean, I think with the Decalogue or 10 Commandments, what we've tended to do is divorce them from their liturgical context. So we forget that when they were revealed by God, that it was in the context of all these directives regarding right worship. And really the 10 Commandments starts with thou shalt have no other gods before me. We don't tend to, I mean, we've turned it into a rule, I guess, but we forget that God is starting with, you shouldn't practice idolatry.
Well, and I'll even help you out. Sorry if I just interrupt real quick. What he says before that is, I am the Lord your God. Yeah. Right? So even before we get to, I mean, your point, the most important part of the Decalogue happens right before it. I am your God. And then to your point, but everything follows. This is how I stay your God.
And yeah, that just ties right into what you were saying about the Beatitudes, where we use, like in the New Testament, the Greek term makarios is used, and that's translated blessed. It's actually a good term for happiness. We get into this in conversations with our students where we say, how does the Bible talk about happiness? How does even the great philosopher Aristotle talk about happiness? Because we tend to reduce happiness to how I'm feeling that day. It's kind of this subjective sense that's tied to my emotions and things. But when Aristotle talks about happiness, when Jesus Christ talk about happiness, they both kind of have in view makarios. It's like this blessedness. It's kind of this fullness of life. And as you point out, I mean, this is something really fascinating to chew on. When Jesus talks about happiness, he doesn't give sort of like a directive that says, this is how you achieve happiness. He says, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are those who are persecuted for my name's sake. And with all of those things, it's mostly passive. It's things that are happening to someone. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's one of the hardest parts of the spiritual life for me. In the context of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus has this whole section on anxiety. Like, don't worry. Like the lilies of the field, their raiment was more glorious than Solomon in all of his splendor. The birds of the air, God takes care of them. Like, how much more does he care for you? It's a mentality that we sort of develop, but it's not a 6-step plan. That's hard for personalities like mine to cope with.
Well, I think this is a great stopping point to get to the break. And when we get back, we need to talk about this paradox of don't be anxious, but none of this is about certainty. And so this is a perfect pivot point. But usually, like, this is the reverse one, right? I ask the big question that goes on too long, and you wrapped it up perfectly right into the break. We're living into the reverse rules. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Let's get right to it. Bud, we ended the last segment talking about anxiety, and this whole show we've been talking about the way, the truth, and the life, and how when we hear Jesus saying that about himself, it's easy for us to reduce the way to a checklist, the truth to certainty, and the life to a jackpot or some sort of like big reward at the end that we get for our, putting in our due course of work. So to talk about this, that in the Beatitudes and the sort of fuller Sermon on the Mount, one of the more troubling aspects, as it were, is this idea of not being anxious about anything. Don't worry about your raiment, the lilies of the field, like you said. But that sort of pregnant line about his eyes are on the sparrow, right? And if God cares about the sparrow, aren't you worth many sparrows? One of the most encouraging lines that I can think to talk to someone who has bad self-esteem, but sparrows die, bud, and so do we, right?
Are you Protestant enough to know, I have a Protestant enough background to know his eyes are on the sparrow?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we sing that all the time.
Not one of my favorites.
His eyes are on the sparrow.
So I know he cares for me.
Yeah. So I know he cares for me.
It's pretty syrupy.
Organ resolve. Right. Oh, yes, of course. Okay. And I mean, on one hand, I understand. I mean, it goes back to Black church spirituals have a version of that song. It comes from hearing it from people. It might be like super sappy, but its origins are precisely the most crapped upon people in America, right? And that there's versions of that song if you go back. And, but all sort of cloying, overdone things probably usually have a very vital source somewhere back, if you go far enough. So, I mean, but you're right. Like I've heard horrible warb. I think a sparrow would sing that song better than I've heard some people sing it. But what I'm getting at is, so that's very comforting, but also sparrows die, we face these things. So I think this gets at the heart of the truth. Like there's nothing more true than to say that if he cares about sparrows, of course he cares about you. But certainty would go like, okay, well then all the sparrows end up okay, right? Like they just go to sleep at the end of their life. They never get eaten by wolves or dogs or hit by cars. And you're like, oh, no, there's plenty of sparrow death. Oh, okay, but what about us? And you're like, well, we get hit by cars too. And so how do we reconcile the truth of that statement when we want certainty? And I think that, like you said, is a sort of paradox that maybe we don't have great answers for, because then I would be acting like I have certainty that I don't have. But I do think this is where people manipulate others who are in bad emotional places to try to, sometimes for even the best intentions, to get them into the Christian fold. But when certainty that they promise doesn't show up, I have at least experienced that that's some of the people who fall furthest from the church, because instead of showing the truth, they did a flimsy certainty as a sales pitch instead.
Yeah, and if you go through sacred scripture, it seems like God is anti-certainty. Now, in using that phrase, there's a way where a listener could be like, oh, so these guys are relativists. By no means. But when we think about, go back to that phrase, the way, it's, again, something akin to like a path that you follow. And I think about the great calls in scripture, something like God calling Abraham. And what does God say to Abraham? Like, go to the land that I will show you. He doesn't, God could have easily said, I'm going to take you to Canaan, specifically this strip of land, but it's the land that I'll show you.
Don't worry, the Isaac thing will work out.
Yeah.
Like, and this is how. There'll be a ram up there. Nope.
I had a New Testament example, but I'm blanking on it now.
It's because I was yelling. I'm sorry.
I think it's something akin to like what Jesus says to his followers. Like maybe follow me without unpacking exactly what that will be like.
Oh, yeah.
You can also think of his words to St. Peter, like there will come a day when you'll be led where you don't want to go, et cetera, et cetera. God never really cast this grand vision. It's not like, I think about something like life insurance, where if you follow these terms, this will be the payout when this occurs or whatnot. It's something much more different. But we sort of want certitude, again, sometimes in an epistemological sense, having to do with knowledge, but even with the circumstances of our life. And God not only doesn't provide that, but seems to, I know the example I was thinking of, where his disciples want to know, well, when will the Son of Man return?
Yes.
And Jesus says, no one knows the day or the hour. In fact, this is the one thing the Father doesn't reveal to the Son. I mean, sort of one of those paradoxical, the omniscience of God in relation to Jesus, human nature, et cetera, et cetera. Anyways, so, I mean, the Bible kind of cuts against that grain where in our day and age, for whatever reason, maybe I don't know enough about medieval history to know how they sort of went about this thing, but it seems today there's a lot of wanting to know and a lot of desire for certitude, even in the Catholic world. So we've joked on the show before that I'm the Fatima guy. I'm someone who's read a lot about the apparitions of Fatima. I think the message there is very important. I think it has some great thoughts and insights about penance, which is really what we're called to. But even with something beautiful like that, there's a way where I've seen it talked about and applied where it's Our Lady asked for these things, she requested these things, and if we just do them, if we fulfill the first 5 Saturday devotions, or if we pray 15 decades of the rosary every day, then we can forestall or avoid this near certain disaster or whatnot.
We get the jackpot.
The jackpot. And all that I'm saying is I think we've turned the message into something different than what was originally intended along the lines of what you're saying about certitude.
This is where you're going to get into the fourth secret. No, I'm kidding.
I'm going to get some phone calls on that one.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up. I wonder what the medieval folks thought in regards to us. I don't know, of course, all of them. I've not talked to all of them, but I've read. And you know what's interesting is when they talk about certainty for them is that they're going to die. And I know that sounds like, of course we're all going to die. But they have a visceral understanding, right? Like almost no one who was born didn't have a brother or sister who died either in childbirth or early, plagues. I mean, war, you get to this, right? The certainty is all the things of the earth and death and things like this. So the truth can penetrate the certainties, like the only 2 things in life and certain death and taxes. Medieval people understood that seemingly better than us. But funny enough, for a group of people who really want a lot of certainty, we ignore some of the things that are most certain. I mean, and this gets back to something we've talked about, like you said, in our bioethics class. If you do everything you can to sanitize the lived world of the dead, and that's the most certain thing, right? We all die. It's no wonder that you start looking for certainty elsewhere because you haven't come to peace with the sort of realities of what it means to be human. And so, sorry to go Marshall McLuhan again, what happens is people start to use anything at all as a narcotic effect. They want to numb themselves to the certainties we know that most of them are at least neutral to bad. And so we go find those things in life that can neutralize, can numb those, have the narcotic effect for us to ignore them. Now, obviously, narcotics do that. Food does that. Pleasure does that. But just like any good ethicist points out, those things run out. So we try to start to do sophisticated ones like political movements or belief in things that we think are worthwhile, ourselves, altruism, but eventually, bud, religion. And so one of the most insidious things that I think is sort of has an acid effect on the foundations of people's trust in the church is when we bandy about certitude, which you have so wonderfully point out goes against most of what any book you can read, the Bible having, and we pander to people's need for a certitude, but not like the actual certitude, like you're going to die. And so we go like, if you just follow the checklist with certainty, you'll get the jackpot, rather than saying, if you follow this way and deal with the truth of yourself, right, that you are going to die and you're a sinner and you need redemption, you can live a life, the life of Jesus Christ. That's what we're up against, is the truth of the church being used for a narcotic so that you don't have to deal with the certainties of life. You can have a fake certainty rather than dealing with the truth, walking on that path, the way, and living the life of Christ. And what was the life of Christ, bud? One of radical self-pouring out, of sacrifice, to lose his life so that he can save it.
You've made this interesting point in class that stuck with me in the past. We push death so much to the margins that in our culture, our curse words have become words that remind people of dying.
Yep.
So in the Middle Ages, some of the worst things that you could say are taking our Lord's name in vain, or something like Judas Priest, because it was really offensive to use those things in a crude or flippant manner. But now we have terms, I won't say them on air,
right.
that really the best way to kind of shock people
feces
is to use a term that reminds them of that we're biological creatures who will pass away and die. We need to have our good friend Charlie Camosi come on the show and talk about all that. That'd be, or Jeffrey Bishop for that matter.
Absolutely.
Getting to the last one, because I know we're getting to the end of the show. I think about life. Now, this is one term where when we talk about it, people say, well, are you guys being a little unfair by saying it's not a jackpot? Because it sounds pretty amazing. Mm-hmm. It reminds me of a little debate that I got into at a conference, and I still puzzle over this one. Here, I'll put you on the spot.
It's reverse back.
Let me turn on.
It's like Uno.
Let me turn on my interrogation light. Click. So I was at a conference, and the speaker was actually someone who I deeply respect and still do to this day. But he gave a presentation on the book of Job, and he made a big deal at the end of it that like when Job, so he has his suffering, which God allows Satan to bring about, his afflictions, like children die, he loses everything, he's scraping sores with Voss and things like that. Ooh, Voss. And then at the end, like he basically has this great profession of the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away, blessed be the name of the Lord. And then God restores everything. I don't remember if it was 10-fold or 100-fold, but it's a lot. And the speaker said, like, the ending of the book is really significant. And he was kind of pushing back against like some biblical scholars say like, well, this was added on later to make it more palpable, etc. And I was sort of like, I was kind of pushing back and saying, well, what if that ending wasn't there? Isn't everything that the book says still true? That like, blessed be the name of the Lord in all circumstances. And when God comes to Job, he comes as a whirlwind, and the response that he gives aren't really answers to Job's questions. It's just like, I created everything. It's majestic. You should be silent in the face of it all. And to me, that's kind of the heart of the book, and putting too much of an emphasis on the ending kind of mutes that point. But the guy wouldn't back down. And I was saying, when you get to the New Testament, there's still the same sort of promise, but it's kind of eschatological, meaning you may be crucified, you may face martyrdom, but in the end, like, you'll be vindicated because of the work that God has done in Jesus Christ. That took a long way to get to my question to you, but what do you think about my reading of that book?
No, I would be fighting this guy alongside you. Okay. For a few reasons, which is not to say that the ending's not important. A few things. On one hand, I find it interesting if you read like St. Gregory the Great, who wrote his Moralia on Job. It's a massive book. A lot of what he spends time doing is basically allegorizing the entire thing, first of all. But second, St. Gregory, and if not him, other people certainly saw the book of Job as the prefigurement of Jesus Christ. So when they're reading this, the end, of course, means heaven, which I think is what this guy's getting at. But the idea, of course, is that Job is in some ways resurrected. And so if you think about that as Jesus instead of us, and so you think of it as like the harrowing of hell, like a prefigurement of those things, I don't mind his read as much, but I still think he's missing some of the point. The second thing that I'll point out is, so the end caps of the book of Job are obviously mythic. That will hurt people's feelings, but I mean, there is an obvious genre switch that happens twice. So again, like the beginning of Job opens like The Devil Went Down to Georgia by Charlie Daniels Band, right? It's like Jesus, God is sitting around up in heaven, and the devil like shows up and he's like, "Hey, I was noticing your guy Job." I mean, it's obviously literature, right? That I don't think anybody would look at the. I mean, there probably is, and we're going to get calls on this too. But I don't think official Catholic theology is God sits in a throne room and the devil can show up at any time and make dares about people on earth. So, and myth, of course, doesn't just mean fictional. It means distilled truth. It's a sort of genre about how they present it. The middle section is presented in realist terms, so real that it even takes on the nature of like a rabbinic dialogue, right? Where Job and his friends go back and forth making this argument about suffering until you have the theophany, right? Where God shows up and is sort of like, I mean, this is where it goes in Jewish literature, wisdom literature at least, the chief rabbi from the whirlwind who solves the issue. What I think is important, Bud, is obviously with the mythic beginning and end and the parallel, what you start to see is Job at the beginning with his children and all these things, right? He precisely is a checklist guy, right? He does all of the sacrifices. He will even sacrifice in case his kids did something. At the end, he's the life guy. And I have Ellen Davis, our wonderful professor at Duke, to thank this for. I'm not good enough at the Hebrew on air to like fire this off, but he names his children wonderful, delightful, almost silly names. And the naming of Job's children, so first of all, yes, in the technical way it reads, those are different children, the dead ones remain dead. In the mythic parallel sense, though, it's like he got his children back, but this time he names them and treats them with the delight that, hear this one, bud, that God treats Behemoth and Leviathan. And so think about that the answer for God is like, look how wonderful the world is. And Job, who used to be checklist anxiety guy who really cared about certainty, what's the sort of change he goes through after the big trial that is the middle section of the book of Job? He becomes the life guy who believes in the truth, and he's the way, and he imitates God in his relationship to the bounty of that creation. That's how I would say the guy has a hint of what's right, but I think he misses the essential aspects of Job. And I think Job, I'm so glad you brought this up, because I think that really proves what we've been saying all along.
Oh, man, this is fascinating. I feel like we need to do an entire Job arc. And maybe read
for like a year.
St. Gregory. Radio Reading Roundup will do Job and commentary on Job.
For 2 years.
Maybe 3 weeks.
Yeah.
No, as you were talking, I also pulled up another passage that was coming to my mind. And what's crazy is I was extracting just one verse from a gospel chapter, but the verses that immediately precede it are those where Jesus is precisely talking about, I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. But then listen to this. The thief comes only to steal and to kill and to destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the fullest. And so sort of like my last comment for the show, I'll give you the last word, Bo, is we have to constantly come back to that promise of our Lord that he came not to condemn us, but to give us, some say life abundantly, abundant life, fullness of life. And it may take a lifetime, but it's certainly going to take some discipline, spiritual discipline, to experience that fullness of life. And we have to, I was reading a spiritual writer, it may have been Francis de Sales. I can't recall precisely who was saying it, but he was saying we tend to think of mysticism or the life of the mystics as only set aside for consecrated religious or for the saints,
right?
Like folks who take themselves out of daily life and, fast rigorously and they live in a monastic cell or something. But he was saying we're all called to be mystics. And so the promise that God has for you is that at some point on the Christian journey, you'll experience the kind of contemplation that Teresa of Avila did or that Padre Pio did, right? And we sort of shortchange ourselves. Now, that can't be forced. Again, it's not 6 steps or a checklist where, like, if I do these things, God will guarantee me this sort of experience of Catholicism. But that fullness of life, I just want to say it's not something that we put off until eternity. Well, a better way to say it is it's eternity entering into our present lives. Mm-hmm. And so ask God for that grace, because the Macarius or the blessedness that's promised in the New Testament, it's so much greater and incomprehensible than the sort of like frivolous kind of temporary subjective forms of happiness that the world proffers. And those always come with a cost. So you can produce a kind of transcendence, so to speak, by taking certain substances or even through like spending your weekends playing video games. There's all sorts of ways that the world kind of tries to like shortcut this experience. But ask God for the grace that Macarius, I think it's connected to mysticism, but it's even beyond that. It's going to look specific to our individual lives and our station in life, but it's a grace that we can't, fully comprehend.
No, I love that. And particularly, it's even the case, right, that people can weaponize the church or religion to be that narcotic effect like you're talking about. To go back to Job, there's a way in which that's what his friends were falling afoul of. They wanted certainty. Like, Job, you have to have been the sinner because your life ended this way, right? You didn't follow the checklist, so you're not getting the jackpot. Job, that's what the craziness about the book of Job and him imitating Christ's faithfulness is the guy who's lodging the complaint against God believes in the way. So he'll follow it all the way through, like the living hell he's going through. And he doesn't want certainty. He wants the truth. He wants to know, how can this be the case about me? And then he's not asking for a reward. He's asking for life. He wants the life. And that ended up with the mysticism of the whirlwind, right? He didn't go do, these crazy fasts, or like you're saying, and not to bash any of that. Job was a normal guy with a wife and kids. He was a fussy father, anxious about what they should do, but he followed the way, searched for truth rather than certainty, and life itself showed up in the whirlwind. And afterwards, like you said, he showed that beatitude, not in the stuff he got back, but how he treated the stuff that he was given. Wonderful stuff. I hope that you all found this as inspiring as Bud and I did. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Bud, not to brag on ourselves, what a very wonderful... I truly had insight into things that I did not have before I started out. I think the Holy Spirit really did us a favor by having you bring up Job. That's going to stick with me for a while.
No, it's always, yeah. I said no and then yeah. But it's always fun to see where the show goes. You really challenged me when we first started the show, like to leave things a little more open-ended than I wanted to. I was trying to like give you bullet points.
You wanted a checklist.
I wanted a checklist, but it ends up being, it creates the context for hopefully some creative juices. So like you said at the end of the last segment, hopefully folks enjoyed it or appreciated it as much as we felt honored in talking about it. Speaking of appreciation, no, I have a good segue, but if you do want to join us in our prayer life at Iowa Catholic Radio, we pray the rosary on air at 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. And then at 2:55 in the afternoon, the Chaplet of Divine Mercy. So we invite you to join our prayer life. You can always use the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray the rosary anytime, anywhere.
I was thinking that if we were really arrogant, we should rename the show The Way. But first of all, I'm sure there's multiple shows named that. And then again, quite arrogant. So we'll stick with The Uncommon.
What's our motto again from Joan of Arc?
Act and he will act.
I feel like that
God.
Gets in.
Yep.
Like that heads that direction.
Man, good job, Bo and Bud from the past. If you want to know other things that are happening in the future rather than the past, you can go to iowacatholicradio.com and look at events. On February 9th, West Des Moines at noon, St. Francis of Assisi Catholic Church out in West Des Moines. Man Up West Power Lunch. Father Nick Smith, parochial vicar at Christ the King in Des Moines, the host of the Daily Gospel Reflection on Iowa Catholic Radio, will provide us with ways we can prepare for an apostolic Lent. The very next day, February 10th, in Ankeny at 5 o'clock at the FFA Enrichment Center, Trivia Night by Candlelight Green Gala. The St. Luke, the Evangelist Catholic School, would like to invite you to participate in their annual Green Gala. They'll have dinner, drinks, a live silent auction, and all good stuff like that. February 18th through 19th in Madrid, 3 p.m. and 7 p.m., Hanson Hall at St. Malachi, Anthony Digman. March 9th in Cedar Rapids, St. Pius X Catholic Church in Cedar Rapids. Yes, the Archdiocese of Dubuque Men's Conference. John Edwards from Just a Guy in the Pew, the Archbishop. You can go check that out. And then, of course, later in April 12th at St. John and Paul Catholic Church in Altoona, Peter Herbeck, inspiring evening with Peter Herbeck at St. John and Paul Church, where faith and fellowship come alive. But it's really important for people to know that we appreciate all that they do. I know that at some point we'll be having a spring fundraiser, but here even with the days are getting longer finally. Maybe you're getting out and about. Maybe you're getting more of a chance to hear Catholic radio. And if you enjoy and appreciate what's going on, please consider not only praying for us and volunteering, but also materially supporting us through your almsgiving. Lent also is coming up, so maybe that would be a good time to engage the spiritual practice of almsgiving. Think about Iowa Catholic Radio so we can keep this ministry rolling. It's not just the people on air, behind the boards, or behind the desks. It is your ministry as well. Thank you for all that you do for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good. We appreciate it. You can donate at Iowa Catholic Radio, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or calling or texting 515-223-1150. Bud, wonderful show, my friend.
Yeah, you mentioned Lent. I also think of tax season. It's just a time of year where you can think about charitable giving. But I was also kind of blown away by how much is going on in the diocese. We're blessed to have a vibrant diocese like this.
Well, I'm very glad that we also got to include Dubuque as well, because we're expanding the listening area that people hear from. So we'd love to hear from people out that way as well. This is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.